Oh, hello there. Yes. Well, good grief. The madness continues, doesn't it? Indeed, yes. Did have to smile at this particular interview on Sky. Israeli spokesperson arguing that it's a preemptive war of defence, which got me thinking to loads of events of August 1939 where various people made exactly the same point. I'm sure it's entirely a valid thing to do. After all, get your retaliation in first, as the old saying goes. Next up, in terms of stuff yesterday, I had to smile at the ability of the British media to project forwards exactly what their particular billionaire overlords want you to read. I think back to the 1980s when there were loads of articles in places like the Daily Mail telling you that all the hip kids were Thatcherites now. And as a hip kid in the 80s, no, they weren't. But that didn't stop them, of course, that whole, hip to be square people. And anyone that says that just isn't, which I think is a bad look for me. Anyway, there was this one, Why Under 30s Are Ditching Work From Home, which features a whole bunch of people who are solidly living in London and middle class enough so that it's not really an issue. However, for the rest of us, sometimes the idea of commuting 4 hours a day isn't particularly lovely. I personally am working from home solidly now. Oh, boo, here's bad man. You bad man. Yes, but it means that I don't have to get on my bike and basically go out in the rain for 40 minutes to get somewhere just for 2 hours work. It's a pointless thing for me to do, and oddly I don't do that anymore. Still, if you're a nice Daily Telegraph person working in the media and you only commute, 10 minutes on the tube, I suppose it's very sensible. But it isn't a thing, is it? And the article manages to just generally slag off anybody under the age of 30, as is traditional, because after all, that's not us, is it? But anyway, on to the meat of the day. I was struck by this. Robert Toombs, who, for those of you who don't know, is certainly a right-wing, probably anti-woke historian, if I can put it that way. But he put this one up, which I thought, well, I was quite intrigued by it. There's been a lot of foolish talk about immigration lately. These islands have almost never seen immigration at current levels, and when they did, it was not pleasant. Now, I do have the feeling that the subheader there has been put there by a sub-editor probably, because the actual article is very, very nuanced for a change. See, that's why I was drawn to it, as history. Anyway, talking of history, here's two people that soon will be. Yes. Anyway, it's worthwhile just diving into some of this, so bear with me, okay? Most politicians and activists have always regarded history not as a source of wisdom, but as a handy rhetorical device. When history became a quasi-scientific subject in the 19th century, its aim to cut through rhetoric and myth-making and discover often awkward and complicated truths. Despite postmodernist assertions, there is no objective reality. This is what most professional historians still try to do, and why they read archives, analyse statistics and study context. But for some, what counts more than analysis is pushing a narrative that serves a cause and their careers, even when the evidence is against them. Some things are exaggerated, others are played down. African rulers enthusiastic for slave trading, violent Muslim conquest, the cruelty and oppression of many pre-colonial societies. In the West, this is linked with left-wing obsessions about race and colonisation. But Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, and for the sake of balance, let me add Donald Trump, are equally keen abusers of history, with Tibet and Ukraine the main victims so far. No surprise there. Yeah, which is sort of like standardised right-wing stuff, but he does at least, both sides it. And I think realistically, when you read more of this stuff, he's actually taking a bit of a swipe at those so-called historians that we do get to see. Yes, I do mean you, Ralph Hayden-Mainku, on our social media platforms, who will insist that there's one particular version of history, and it oddly is one that coincides very much with what their funding bodies want. Yes, I am looking at you, Peter Whittle. Our own history too has been and is being carefully moulded by people in unaccountable positions of influence, and is being propagated by schools, universities and museums. I noticed the other day that even the King's Gallery is not entirely immune. People mould history to serve ideological causes or in the hope of calming tensions, as in the case of museums, to attract new customers. Hence, the British tend to accept accounts of their own history written by historic opponents. We acquiesce in American accounts of war of independence, getting the slaves and indigenous people who fought for the crown, and to nationalist accounts of empire. Yes, and I would actually thoroughly agree with him here. What? You're sort of saying that the museums can't put these kind of things up? No, but everything needs to be seen within a wider and potentially disputed context. If you look at, for example, the history of the American War of Independence, which is just simply presented to us as a bunch of white people having a bit of a fracas, it really wasn't. There was an awful lot more going on in terms of people of an immigrant or slave or indeed indigenous people status there. And it's worthwhile thinking about those things, why it is, particularly given our sort of modern penchant for complicated conflicts, why it is, for example, that various people might seem to side with their oppressors on a wider context. These things are kind of important, but to simply dismiss them as simply being the ravings of a radical fringe doesn't really help anybody. One of the most taught subjects in English schools today is the Atlantic slave trade. Here, Britain's role, especially in abolition, was indeed globally epoch making. Nevertheless, it is a brief and marginal episode in England's own long saga and not its principal theme. The history of Britain's institutions is little taught, and the creation of England itself apparently not at all, despite England arguably being the prototype of the nation state. Why is there an England? Why a Britain? What is distinctive about them? You would be unlikely to find out in school. And yes, I would actually agree with that. I personally trained to be a citizenship teacher back in the day when citizenship was a thing. It's been abandoned now because when David Blunkett brought it in, yes, that long ago, back in the early 2000s, there was a real worry that young people weren't voting. Now there's a real worry that young people are voting, so obviously it needs to be swept under the carpet. But you need to, try and teach people some notion about what the mechanisms of the state are. And there's almost none of it in real terms. There's one unit in GCSE history called Power to the People, which is kind of about the development of democracy, although it's a real kind of David Starkey view of it, whereby various barons in 1302 have an important role to play, which is very debatable, and it does tend to sort of gloss over a lot of mass movements that there were in the past. Again, a nuanced view of history there, yeah? The reason why people rise up against their rulers are multifaceted, but it is rarely covered. And our own institutions and the way that they have moulded themselves over time, and problematic episodes, one might say. One particular one is thinking of things like the Glorious Revolution, when we were invaded, and the subsequent very nasty things that went on in Scotland and Ireland afterwards, which are just simply brushed away as stuff that didn't really happen because it was over there. These things are, again, important. It's notoriously difficult to decide what history should be taught and how. It is easy, however, to say that what should be taught, propagandist narratives that are at best simplistic and anachronistic, and at worst patent falsehoods. One obvious example is the slavery and imperial exploitation created by British prosperity. That's created British prosperity. Another is that past empire makes Britain today racist. Evidence shows the opposite. Well, possibly, but again, I would argue that that's a more nuanced view. You can argue pluses and minuses with these kinds of things. History should teach complexity, not simplicity. Oh, indeed. Past societies sometimes succeeded with resources far less than ours. That people thought differently from us and were not necessarily wrong. That political decisions are hard and that the future is never clear. Think of Chamberlain and appeasement. Even children can learn these things. They might even remember them when they become adults. Perhaps one day a responsible government will help this to happen. And I can actually but agree with that. It would be nice to see a lot more nuanced discussion with young people in schools about loads and loads of different notions, about the notion of democracy and the role that it might play in their lives, but there is precious little of it, despite the fact that all of the evidence about young people's involvement in schools is very, very positive. If you can get young people to vote in school elections, however matter how trivial it is, they are far more likely to accept that notion as adults. But there are a lot of vested interests out there that don't want young people to be like that young people shouldn't question things, and I can only stand shoulder to shoulder with Robert Toombs, even though we would disagree about vast numbers of things. These things should be taught in schools. If we're going to have a participatory democracy, then it needs a level of participation, rather than a bunch of people telling us that the Atlantic slave trade was just one of those kind of weird blips that we just did, and weren't we great about everything afterwards, and the fact that the British Empire was just uniformly brilliant, and if you say there's anything wrong about it, well, there were just vague accidents that nobody really wanted to happen. Anyway, food for thought, I hope. Do have a glorious day if you can do. Enjoy the sunshine. It's looking like it's going to be a very warm, hot summer. But thankfully, Toby Young tells us it's not due to anything to do with climate change, which is good news and will please his big oil backers no end. Do have a good one.